Now available in paperback and coming to Kindle Unlimited this Halloween. Spinsterella. Get your goth on with this dark and spooky romance from Shawn James. Spinsterella. Now available in paperback and coming to Kindle this Halloween. I just saw the video of the girl who was manhandled by the police officer in South Carolina, and it was very disturbing for me. In fact, it took me back to my high school days at Park West High School and Taft High School here in New York. Now, back then, your high schools were pretty much a zoo, and it was a zoo filled with silverbacks and other sorts of savage animals. And when you're in an environment like that, it's very, very, very dangerous. So I look at that classroom, and that classroom was compared to the one I was in, was pretty much, in a little bit more control than this one. What I saw in that situation was, adults who had lost control over the classroom and, lost control over the whole situation. Now, they say that the whole of this situation was because this child was using a cell phone in the classroom. Now, as a person who has family members who work in education, I can tell you that this situation, was not handled, appropriately. If there was a situation like this where you're dealing with a disruptive child who refuses to comply, you really don't need to call police in. Now, from what I've read, they told her to go to the principal's office, which was a mistake right there. Um, then they brought administrators to come in, which was another mistake. And then they called the police to try to force this child to do what they want them to do, and the whole situation got completely escalated when there was a better way to handle this. I wonder, where was the school security you know, in this situation? You didn't need to call a police officer in. You needed to have, school security and have them, deal with this child. But, my family member who worked in education, she has seen this situation go on with children as young as 6 years old. And she told me about a situation where she was working where, in another teacher's classroom, a 6 year old went on a rampage where they destroyed several iPads and tore up a classroom. And in this situation, she said that the havoc that was done, they literally, let that child, have their meltdown, destroy school property, and they didn't call any police in. They waited eventually for EMS to come in to strap this child in and take them to the hospital because that's the policy here in New York State. The policy here is you don't touch them, you can't engage them, and I think that's really one of the big problems in education is that we have these policies that prevent people from administering discipline effectively. Because I look at that classroom and it follows everything that my family member told me, about these classrooms and how all these rules and policies prevent them from being able to effectively deal with situations like this. I mean, I remember when I was in high school, a kid would come in with his Walkman on, and the teacher would tell him, put the Walkman away. And some of these kids, they would not put the Walkman away. They would sit there and continue to have it out. Some of them would put the headphones on, and yeah, it's disruptive. But a good teacher is going to say, look, I know how to pick my battles. I'm just not going to deal with this person. I'm going to try to, continue to try to teach the rest of the class. This person, I'm just going to have to write them off and then continue to deal with those who want to learn. Now, if she was acting out in class, eventually you just reach a point where you just have to just say, you know what, you have to leave. But if this is the case and the infraction is just a cell phone, okay, you want to use a cell phone? Go ahead and use a cell phone. Now, I looked at the classroom, everybody had laptops. So she wanted to use a cell phone, let her go ahead. She's done. I mean, there's not much you can do. As a teacher, you have to understand, there are battles you can pick. And, there's some just not worth dealing with. And this is what I've heard from my family members, in education, that there are certain people you just aren't going to be able to work with. And what you want to do is, just get through that 45 minutes and, make sure that this person, leaves your classroom and work with the ones you can work with. The other one, that the one disruptive one, you're not going to be able to do anything with. And the time you take to try to deal with this dysfunctional person is time that that other kids are going to lose. So you just basically are better off not dealing with that dysfunctional person. And in most cases, that's what most teachers do. They go, look, I can't do anything with that one. That one, I'm just gonna, let them sit in the class. They want to act the fool, and at the end of the day, they're gonna get a 55. But I look at today's new policies. They tell you can't fail them, you can't discipline them, and here in New York, you can't even suspend them anymore. So what we saw with this officer manhandling this child, guess what? We're going to see a lot more of these officers manhandling kids because remember, the kids who were insane at 6 years old that my family member had to deal with are going to eventually grow up to become just like this child that you saw right here. Because if you're destroying iPads at 6, imagine what they're going to be doing when they become teenagers. And this is something that, many in education just don't understand. And they think that these liberal policies, where you can't discipline them, you can't suspend them, and you can't even expel them, are going to, help this child. All that's going to do is enable more dysfunction in the child because the child is learning that there are no penalties for their behavior. And that's why many teachers, when I was in high school, pretty much wrote people off because they said they couldn't do anything with them. So they just let them, some of the more, more apathetic ones just pass them on because they figure, hey, if I fail anybody, I'm going to lose my job. But you know what? Other ones just failed them and said, look, I'm not going to deal with this. I'm going to deal with those who want to learn, and I'm going to leave this person right here. But this officer's actions, they were extremely excessive. There was no need for him to get that rough with this child, no matter how dysfunctional she was. What his behavior reminded me a lot of was this Officer Pantaleo here in New York who choked out Eric Garner. Now, this officer, he used excessive force, and he has a record of federal civil rights lawsuits against him. And, the guy is not fit for duty and should have been terminated, but he's still working here in the state of New York, just like this officer, here is. And he has 2 civil rights lawsuits against him. He beat up a member of our military, and did something to him, and he still remains on the job. And that shows, a big problem with our law enforcement is that, there needs to be some type of discipline and even termination for dysfunctional officers. If an officer is really bad, he doesn't belong on the force. He just needs to find himself another job someplace else where, he can be, better suited. Now, this guy wants to be a weightlifter and all this stuff. Let him go on and go participate in some bodybuilding competitions or whatever he wants to do. But law enforcement is not the job for him. There is no need to get this rough with a child. Again, there are other ways to handle these type of situations. Back in the day when I was in high school, when there was a child like this, most teachers would have just taught around them and continued to work with them. What I saw again in that classroom was people who had lost complete control. The child was dictating the situation. This is something that my family member who worked in early child education saw on the regular, that, a lot of teachers just let the situation just it deteriorates because they allow the child to dictate the situation instead of being the authority figure and the leader. And the problem with a lot of these situations is that these children don't see adults as authority figures and leaders because, these policies that are created pretty much don't tie teachers' hands, tie administrators' hands, and prevent them from being able to establish that line of authority and even, impose penalties on children for participating in violent and disruptive behavior. I mean, a child here in New York can pretty much, again, destroy an entire classroom full of iPads, flip over desks at 6 years old, and go on a rampage, and all that's called is EMS. And then in many cases, the principals won't even file a report because they fear that administrators will come down on them if you file a report saying that, there was an incident. So they make every effort, to cover up incidents like this. And I mean, a child could be going crazy in a classroom, and because they don't want their numbers, to look bad. They don't want their school to look bad. In many cases, these same principals and some of the teachers will not even report it. So a lot of times, as this kid, is passed on from grade to grade, nobody knows, how dangerous this child is, or how dangerous their behavior, you know, is to other students. And this is how we wind up with time bombs like you saw in that classroom in South Carolina. Um, and this is something that many people, they don't really look at and they don't really understand, because you really have to understand how, school systems work and how these policies, tie people's hands. I mean, I look at the whole thing as you don't need to call the police on this type of person. They want to use a cell phone. Yeah, there's a rule for that, but and you want to keep, order, but sometimes, you have to pick your battles. And a smart teacher is like, look, I'm not going to, escalate this thing, make the classroom even more disruptive, more out of control, because then the child is dictating things and they're making people emotional. And then you have, with this case, you have this officer who's emotional. And that's how we wind up with situations like this. What I saw there was nobody was calm, nobody was in control, and the classroom, pretty much deteriorated into this mayhem that we saw. Um, Again, you have to understand how to deal with a classroom situation. You have to understand, how these things work. And a lot of people are not really, trained in how to deal with disruptive children and, disruptive environments. It's a really, really tricky situation from what my family member has told me. But you have to know how to deal with certain things. Sometimes you would have, and like when she would have to deal with it, was she said, look, as long as he wasn't hurting anyone, I'll let him go on, and I'll call up somebody to come take him out, because there's nothing that she's gonna get. She's not gonna mess herself up, unless he's trying to harm someone else. It's like, look, if you want to mess yourself up, go ahead and mess yourself up. And if your parents don't care, and this is another big problem that a lot of people don't understand, a lot of these parents really don't care, and they let their kids, pretty much go off the chain in school. If you try to tell the parents that, look, your child is behaving in a disruptive manner, you'll have to deal with this parent who will argue with you, try to shout with you, and some of them will even go to the school board and say that you're the one causing all the problems, even when you have a record, of these behaviors. But it's like a lot of teachers wind up in a logjam because you have these parents who don't want to work with you. You have principals who want to hide, the information because they're afraid of administrators. And this is what leads to these kids slipping through the cracks, and then eventually, winding up with, we have a situation like this. Yes, the child was wrong, but the officer was also wrong. And I look at this whole situation, and I also see how administrators, have created this hostile environment where, your schools are starting to turn back into the zoos that they were when I was in high school back in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Now that's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.